Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Baez. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am absolutely honored to be giving your guest lecture today, which is on queerness. I would like to thank Professor Dazzle for this opportunity, and let's get started. I think that it's only fitting that if we're going to be talking about queerness, that I talk about and introduce myself to just give you my standpoint and my positionality as I give you this presentation. So I'm 25 years old. I identify as queer, fat, trans femme, specifically transgender, and then femme identifying. I identify as Afro Latinx, and both of my parents are from the Dominican Republic. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, in Sunset Park. I'm an alumnus of Brooklyn College. I was the class of 2018, where I studied political science and women's and gender studies. And I was a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow and a CUNY Pipeline fellow with Professor Dazzle. And most importantly, I'm a Cancer, and I say that partly just as a joke. I think zodiac signs are fun to talk about. However, I'm also a teaching assistant at my institution, an educator, and I really think that my zodiac sign and my water signness really helps inform the ways that I go about teaching and engaging with students. And then professionally, I am a third year PhD student in the Department of American Studies. American Studies is the study of American culture, very broadly defined. Many people think that when I study American Studies that I'm studying like traditional US history and the colonies, and it's far from the work that I do. And I'm getting my PhD at the George Washington University, which is located in Washington, D.C. A little bit about my research. When I first entered grad school, I was continuing research that I had started in college, where I examined discrimination on LGBTQ dating applications, such as the dating app Grindr. So, my undergraduate thesis examines the experiences of queer, fat people of color on online dating applications, most notably No Fats, No Femmes culture, where people who are fat, people who are feminine, femme presenting in any ways, and people who are not white are discriminated against and experience harassment and violence on dating applications. So my thesis was about that, where I interviewed 8 people and got their experiences on these apps. Now, about a year or two ago, my research changed dramatically, and now my research examines queer and trans of color fat aesthetics. And by this, I mean, how do queer and trans fat women and femmes of color represent their experiences, their bodies in media? So I've been looking at a few different people. I've been looking at a famous photographer, a performance artist, and a TV personality. So that's where my work is today. And if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to field those via email. So, for our learning objectives today, I want us to first understand the complexity of the definitions of the term queer. Then, I want us to learn about the academic fields that study queerness. Next, I want us to understand the most common use of queer today. And finally, I want us to understand a less popular, arguably more open definition of the term. So, queer is complicated, and I think more than anything else, this is the point I want to stress for you all today. Queer is complicated. Um, I think that it's always a really interesting exercise to look up words in the Oxford English Dictionary because they'll give you like all sorts of genealogies of a term. And so when I look up the term queer, we have 5 very different definitions that I want to begin talking about. The first one refers to the colloquial term we'll get into most today, which refers to a homosexual, especially a homosexual man. Next, queer can mean strange, odd, peculiar, and eccentric, also of questionable character, suspicious, and dubious. Next, queer can refer to counterfeit or forged coins, money, or banknotes. Queer can also mean to ask or inquire, to question something. And then finally, queer can mean to put out of order and to spoil. And I think this is a really helpful way to engage queerness because by understanding the various connotations and definitions of queer, it can help us realize that queerness as a concept is never going to be tied down to one definition, no matter what point we are in history. While there is a predominant definition today that we'll get into, queerness as a term is so flexible and is used in more ways than we imagine. And so I think always return to all of these weird definitions that are almost similar but not quite saying the same things. Now I want us to get into the academic studies of queerness. So, two of the most prevailing fields are listed here. So, when people started doing research on people who are not straight and not cisgender, they were doing work within the fields of gay and lesbian studies, which is quite literally the research about gay and lesbian people. It used to be abbreviated GL. One of the most common journals today is called Gay and Lesbian Quarterly, GLQ, in the academy. And gay and lesbian studies is how people did research about people who are not straight. Sometimes this research may have been problematic, might have been pathologizing, but this was the first academic field to center the experiences of people who are not straight. But note here that this language is not inclusive. Like, where is any mention of trans people or bisexual people? And so the language then became more inclusive to LGBTQ studies, which is a field that researches that researches a variety of people and their identities, and this language is more inclusive. And here I've included two covers of books that I have engaged with when I wrote my thesis back in college. The first one is Fat Gay Men, Girth, Mirth, and the Politics of Stigma. And in Fat Gay Men, Jason Whitesell examines social clubs of gay fat men and how are they in community with each other and what are their social spaces like. So it's sociological, it's ethnographic, which means that Whitesell was entering groups and learning about them and interviewing them for years. Next to this cover is a book called Tacit Subjects: Belonging and Same-Sex Desire Among Dominican Immigrant Men. And I love this book. It caught my eye, especially being Dominican. And this book is fascinating because it talks to people who were born in the Dominican Republic or were born and raised in the States who identify as Dominican, and most of them live in Washington Heights. And it talks about how they describe their sexuality. And DeSena argues that they don't represent their identities in ways that we think. Like, in Dominican culture, coming out isn't the thing that we imagine it to be in other contexts. His book is super fascinating, but here are just two examples of what LGBTQ studies looks like. Now I want to pivot into queer theory. So queer theory is a field of critical theory that questions what we consider to be normal about sex, gender, and sexuality. Queer theory is interesting because it's a bit dense in how it's very dense, honestly, and it can be really tricky to get through. It's not always writing about people that are alive. It is oftentimes abstract. So while the books in the previous slide are about people and their experiences and how they live their sexuality, queer theory doesn't make statements about people's sexualities, but makes very broader statements about sexuality, gender, and sex writ large. Queer theory, though, has focused primarily on white people for the most part. And so, as a formation, queer of color critique arose which is a field which takes race more closely and more critically in the analysis of gender, sex, and sexuality. The first book we have here is by Judith Butler, and it's called Gender Trouble. Gender Trouble examines if you ever heard of the notion that gender is a social construct or that gender is a performance or the language of performativity, that is Judith Butler. This book is foundational to queer theory. The book to the right is really foundational to queer of color critique and queer theory as well. It is Aberrations in Black Towards of Queer Color Critique, and it is the first book to make one of the most explicit direct critiques of queer theory. My work is situated, I place it within queer of color critique. I find that queer of color critique really moves me and I feel like I relate to it more. But queer theory is foundational for helping us think about these categories, but it can be really tough to get through. But I will close with saying that the difference between the books on this slide and the books on this slide is that the books on this slide are focused more on the experiences of people on the day to day. This in Fat Gay Men, Weitzel is doing research with going into communities, and so is Carlos Ulises de Sena. However, in Gender Trouble and Aberrations in Black, they're not going into communities and talking to them about how their identities are formed. The research is more what you would consider armchair work, where it's not within communities, but rather is doing theoretical work about identities in an abstract sense. Which brings us to which brings us closer to the definition of queer. So, queer, first and foremost, is a reclaimed term. Let's return to the first definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. As a derogatory term for someone who is a homosexual, and specifically a homosexual man. So, queer in its first iteration was always negative and derogatory and harmful to people. And in some ways, it's a slur still. But one of the major the major presentations of the term that reclaimed it is by a group called Queer Nation, whose slogan was "We're here, we're queer, get used to it" in the 80s and 90s. And I've presented images of some of their activism to show you this kind of in your face attitude of reclaiming this word. Now, I want to note that for some people, the term queer is a word that should not be reclaimed, and many people never want to do work with it or use it to define themselves. And I think it's important to understand that not everybody who is in a group that is oppressed will use the word the same way. I use the word queer. Many of my loved ones that I know who are queer use the term, but there are some people who are not interested in reclaiming the term. And there are other kinds of terms out there that are derogatory that we know of, that people feel just uncomfortable with. But again, I want to stress that it's up to the person in that community to decide if the word is for them. And so here, the point is that queer is a reclaimed term. And the most important, or not important, the most popular definition of queer is that queer is an umbrella term. Queer today is used most to refer to people who are not heterosexual and are not cisgender. The most the people always will talk about the acronym. The longest acronym to refer to people who are not straight and are not cisgender is LGBTQIP2SAA. And this acronym stands for the following letters: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, queer, intersex, pansexual, two spirit, androgynous, and asexual. However, Important to note that I think most people today, in and outside of the academy, tend to say LGBTQ or LGBTQIA plus. So it's up to you on which ones you would like to be more ethical about. Would you like to be the most accurate, or do you want to use the shorthand version? But the acronym is constantly evolving. It's constantly evolving because there are so many identities that are considered non-normative that exist today, and so the acronym is constantly being revised to be more inclusive. But typically, when you say queer, it assumes that these are some of the identities that you're referring to in your definition. But also, I also like to use the shorthand LGBTQI plus or LGBTQ, even shorter. But again, queer here is a reclaimed term in which people refer to people who are not straight and not cisgender. And I think I want to just take a pause for a second to just talk about an important question of how do we talk about people's identities? I think that one of the most important things to do is to never assume someone's identity. Everyone does not use the term queer. And again, going back to this term of like the reclamation politics of a term, if someone uses a different term for their sexuality, prioritize and respect that one. A really good example of this is I research about a lesbian photographer named Laura Aguilar who identified as a lesbian. The term queer is not incorrect when talking about her. However, the most common word she used to refer to herself is lesbian. And so, therefore, it is the best practice to use the term that someone uses to refer to themselves, even if they are in the LGBTQIA community. Something I tend to get into the practice of is asking people, how do you define your sexuality? And typically, like, they'll just say I'm straight, I'm gay, I'm queer, I'm lesbian, I'm bi, I'm pan. And the takeaway here is that umbrella terms should not mean that we stop working to learn about each other. Just because someone uses the term queer does not mean that that's the only word they use, and everybody's queerness is different. And so, if someone uses the term queer, ask and invite more questions on how do they define their queerness, who are they attracted to as a queer person, who are they not attracted to, etc. And so the last point that I want us to get into is the notion of queer as non-normative. And so I want us to consider the second definition offered by the Oxford English Dictionary, which refers to strange, odd, peculiar, eccentric, also of unquestionable character, suspicious, and dubious. So, queerness is not perfectly represented in words, which I will say more about in a second. People who are LGBTQIA plus may live quite normal lives, and finally, there are ways of being different that are not easily defined. I wanted to just say more about the second term quickly. There are people who are LGBTQIA plus who live lives that resemble what it might mean to be heteronormative, meaning like having a nuclear family, having children, being monogamous, etc. And so sometimes people might consider queer to be a more radical way of living, whereas being gay might not be as radical. But that aside, I think that there are ways that we live in this world where there are people who might not feel comfortable with LGBTQIA as the words they use to describe themselves. And they might feel intimidated by the term queer because they don't identify within the community. And so I want us to think about the ways that we feel strange, odd, and peculiar or not normal in this world. And I want us to understand that queerness as a word can hold space for those kinds of feelings. And I want us to just sit with this quote for a second. This was posted by someone named Fatima Jamal, who is a queer, trans, fat, black woman who models and is producing a documentary called No Fats, No Femmes. And she is quoting Bell Hooks here, and Bell Hooks is a famous black feminist writer who has amazing work out there. And one of her most notable works is a book called All About Love. Fatima quotes Bell Hooks, who said, "Queer not as being about who you're having sex with, that can be a dimension of it, but queer as being about the self that is at odds with everything around it and has to invent and create and find a place to speak and to thrive and to live." There's so much going on in this quote, but I think one of this was eye opening for me, and I'm still working on understanding this notion. But I think while the main definition of queer, again, is about people who are in the LGBTQ community, queer theory and many people's lived experiences want us to think about queer as not just about who you fuck, but rather being in a world where you're treated like you're different and that you are forced to conform. And there are so many ways that this world has us trying to conform. And so queerness, no matter what, is not just about who you fuck, but queerness is about being different. And in some ways, it's tricky, but I think one thing I try to think about with this is like, it's about feelings. I think that many people, whether they call it queer or not, live in this world feeling different, feeling like they don't belong. And so I think queerness as a term and as a theory asks us to hone in on these feelings. And to illustrate this more, I want to show you all a quick clip of a podcast in which this person, Ocean Vuong, was interviewed. So quickly, Ocean Vuong is a Vietnamese American gay cisgender man. He is a poet, essayist, and novelist. He won a MacArthur Grant, which is one of the most impressive awards someone can win for writing. And he is an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the MFA program in creative writing. And to the left is his book, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, which is a novel. And it's set basically to a queer Vietnamese son writing letters to his mom, who is illiterate and cannot speak English. And it's a very vivid story about queerness, nationality, transnationalism, and language and ethnicity. It's an amazing book, but I did this context because we're about to hear a clip of him talking. And so Vong was doing a podcast because A24 Films is actually in production of turning his book On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous into a film, which is super exciting. And so he was giving a talk with he was having a podcast episode with another author named Brian Washington, and Vong had a very interesting conversation about queerness, which we'll get into right now. I'm gonna just troubleshoot really quickly to make sure that the sound is on. One second. Share sound. That would have been so awkward. Okay. So this is from the episode. The episode is called All the Ways to Be, and I will play it now.
But I think I thought that because I was queer. Queerness, in a way, saved my life. Because I always joke that I said if I wasn't queer, I would probably be at a casino with 7 children drinking Heineken.
That's a very different option.
Yelling at my Vietnamese wife, right? This is because this is the world that I was brought for, and this is the world that a lot of my cousins end up in. You know, and often we see queerness as a deprivation, but when I look at my life, I saw that queerness demanded an alternative innovation from me. I had to make alternative routes. It made me curious. It made me ask, this is not enough for me because there's nothing here for me.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that yourself? I joke. I said,
Yes.
I would be a Mohegan Sun right now, in complete debt, like all of the Vietnamese fathers that I grew up with.
I don't know, like this question of
So there's so much that is interesting about this quote, and I will read it here again for us so we can have it here. Queerness, in a way, saved my life, because I always joke. I say if I wasn't queer, I would probably be at a casino with 7 children drinking Heineken, yelling at my Vietnamese wife, because this is the world that I was brought forth. And this is the world that a lot of my cousins end up in. I think that, again, this notion of queerness really refers to how we are socialized to live in a world that is normative. Vong here is referring to heteronormativity and how if he had never identified as queer openly, he might have been in a heterosexual relationship, abusing substances, gambling, and being a toxically masculine heterosexual man. And I think in some ways, again, this reinforces the definition that queerness refers to people who are in the LGBT community who identify as not heterosexual and not cisgender. But I want to pivot us to that latter half of this quote that reads, often we see queerness as a deprivation. When I look at my life, I saw that queerness demanded, emphasis here, an alternative innovation from me. I had to make alternative routes. It made me curious. It made me ask, this is not enough for me because there's nothing here for me. And again, I think that queerness, while we can talk about the sexual elements of queerness, queerness is also about a way of being and a way of understanding the world. Queerness is about other ways of being in the world. And it's not just about other ways of being, but it's about understanding that we have to imagine and create these possibilities. Queerness is imaginative, and when you are queer and when you are intuitive and deeply queer, you are understanding of that life is not just about what's here, it's about feeling that this is not working, and it's about actively choosing ways to go about these kinds of futurities. And so again, I want to point out that queerness is about strategizing, it's about choosing yourself and choosing a different life for yourself than the one that you're told to be, as many of us are told to be straight and cisgender and all other kinds of things. But most importantly, I think queerness is also about a feeling. It's about a feeling that this world lacks and that this world does not give us everything that we need. And it's about realizing that and doing something about it. And with that, I want to end this lecture by reminding you that queerness is complicated. Yes, the most common definition of queer today refers to people in the LGBTQ community, but the conversation should never end there. Queerness is about more than who you love. Queerness is about the plethora of ways we are different in this world, and it is the feeling and drive to choose ourselves in spite of it. And with that, thank you so much for having me today. If you have any questions about this lecture or want to keep the conversation going, you all are more than welcome to contact me. My email is joebaez@gw.edu, and I will see you in a few weeks for a lecture on representation in the media. Thank you so much.